And good afternoon and welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is Brian Ross, the Chief Investigative Correspondent for the Law&Crime Network, and you're watching a special report from our network and for our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. These are troubling times, a national crisis of the like none of us have seen in our lifetimes. And no one needs to make an apology for being worried, for concern, for really being afraid. So in this half hour, we hope to answer your questions about your job, about your finances, about your home, about your health, and about your rights. We're doing all this, obviously, not from our Law&Crime studios, but from our homes. Our producers and technical staffs from Salt Lake City to Chicago to Philadelphia and across the New York area and the tri-state area, all coming together to provide this special program for you. And joining us now from their homes are two experts in the areas of employment law and other legal issues, beginning with Felicia Ennis in New York City. Felicia's a partner at the firm of Warshaw Burstein, and Jonathan Bell, who is the founder of the Bell Law Group. Let me start by asking you, Felicia, how are you doing?
Good afternoon, Brian. Thanks for having me. I'm here in New York City working remotely like most other people. We are encouraged by the way that people have been able to adapt to this new normal. And we're holding strong here in New York City.
And Jonathan, for you, you're at home as well?
Working from home. My entire office staff is working from home. We've been offering free legal advice to both employees and employers relating to how we could possibly help them. And my phone has been off the hook. So we've been working nonstop, just trying to do our part. We're not in the front line, obviously. We're not medical providers. But the second tier is people working about their paychecks, people concerned about running their business. And that's what we're here for you, trying to help everyone we can.
Let me start by asking both of you, for instance, Macy's announced earlier today laying off 130,000 employees. What rights do those people have for unemployment compensation and to get their jobs back? Felicia, let me start with you.
Yeah, that's an important question that I'm sure a lot of them will have. Obviously, they can file immediately for unemployment. And what's encouraging about that is with the recent stimulus package that was just passed this past Friday, the federal government is providing some expansions on unemployment, including an additional $600 per week that individuals will be entitled to receive, which is extremely important to individuals. There's also going to be an expansion on the number of weeks that you would be entitled to collect unemployment. Typically, states have a 26-week period, and with the new stimulus package, they will have up to 39 weeks to collect unemployment. Also, part of the stimulus package will be checks for individuals and couples and parents with children that will be direct payments to individuals. And again, that will help out a lot during these times. So there's a lot of new benefits available to individuals, and we are really encouraged by what we are seeing in terms of what the federal government is doing and also what we're seeing at the state and local level, especially here in New York.
And Jonathan, what do our viewers have to do to take advantage of all that?
Well, for the SBA loans, it's simple. You don't go through the SBA websites. You got to go through either a financial institution that's FDIC insured, like your bank, and you fill out just a regular application through the bank. The bank then submits it to the SBA, and the SBA will approve it. The SBA is taking the viewpoint that if you're a small business under 500 employees and you're submitting it, you need some help. So what happens is it's starting out as a loan, where they look at your payroll from last year for a period of time, and they're giving you the average at 2.5 or 250% of the average. They're giving you that as a loan. If you use it within 8 weeks and you use it for payroll, utilities, things of that expensive, things that they allow you to use it for, then you apply to your lending institution again to actually turn that into a grant. So actually it's going to become free money for these employers, with the intent is not to lay people off, keep people on. Now, there are certain provisions that they're requiring you to, if you have 10 employees last year, have 10 employees now. If you have 9 employees instead of 10, we'll give you 90% as a grant and 10% of the loan. Or if you are reducing your salary, you could reduce it by 25%, but no more. If you reduce it more than 25%, there are also penalties. Now, for any part that's not going to continue, that's not going to be a grant, that's going to continue as a loan, they're giving it to you at no more than 4% interest rate. That could be deferred from 6 months to a year, and you could have it as a 10-year loan. So there's some great opportunity there.
All right. And Jonathan, our first question coming in along those lines. And by the way, you can post your questions on the chat section at Facebook or YouTube. But here's the question. The word forgiven is in the relief bill in question in regards to small business loans. Does it mean these loans do not have to be repaid ever? Are any risk to small business owners credit for taking them?
Yeah, so it's exactly, that's the exact question I just answered. It starts out as a loan, and then after that 8-week period, you have to submit it again and request that becomes forgiven or a grant. If any portion of that is not forgiven, then it stays as a loan at 4%. If it's a grant, you don't even have to declare that as income on your tax return. So really what the federal government is doing is if you do it correctly, they're giving you free money for expenses for basically 2 months, but you can't use it to go out and buy a car because then it's going to be a loan.
The way these loans are different from other SBA loans, which is also really important to small businesses, is that they don't have to provide collateral or personal guarantees in order to qualify or be eligible for these loans, which is very important.
But they have to go through your local financial institution. Somebody's got to loan the money, per se, right?
Correct.
Felicia, one follow-up question here on another area. How do people apply that have Social Security and have no other income?
People who have Social Security and who are not working are still eligible to receive Social Security through their monthly checks. The different stimulus package benefits for individuals are for individuals who are working and individuals who may be eligible for direct payments from the federal government. And to the extent that you have a Social Security number and you've filed a return in the last year, you will be eligible to receive those individual payments.
And Jonathan, another question. Will the people who receive disability income be eligible to receive a staffing check?
You know what, to be honest with you, I'm going to have to defer to my co-counsel here. I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't read it yet. My understanding is if you're working, you're entitled to it. If you're not working, you're not.
That's a good question as to whether or not if you are disabled and receiving disability, whether you would also be entitled to receive the individual payment. And I think we're still waiting for some more guidance on that.
All right. Well, here's another question. My employer is very good. He says he is going to pay us during the time we're not working, but he says he doesn't have to pay us for the $1,200 for the check we're going to receive from the federal government. Is that accurate?
No, it's separate and apart. It's totally two different policies as far as what they'd be entitled to. Now, understand that to be eligible for that $1,200 check, you have to be a single adult making less than $75,000 a year. And if you are married, up to $150,000 a year, but it's totally separate and distinct. If the employer through the SBA loans definitely has an incentive to keep people on as opposed to lay people off, but one really has nothing to do with the other.
If you're just joining us, this is a special report from the Law&Crime Network about your rights and your questions in the middle of this coronavirus crisis in this country. Here's another question for you right now. Felicia, let me see if you can do this. We want to know what we can do if somebody at our office gets sick. Can we sue the company that made us sick?
That's another interesting question, Brian. You know, the CDC has guidances in terms of what workplaces could do to protect workers. Here it would be essential workers that are still working. OSHA has also published certain guidelines. And what I would tell your viewer, if that they feel that they are working in an environment that is not safe, they should take a look at the OSHA guidances for certain. Obviously, they can contact an attorney, but there is also a complaint mechanism under OSHA that they can file a complaint if they feel like they are being forced to work in a hazardous work environment and their employer has not taken the steps that they could take in order to protect their workers.
Yeah, if I could add a little bit to that, an important point is generally the way the law is, if you're injured at work, your sole remedy is workers' compensation. So you go ahead and you file a workers' compensation claim. That you usually can sue your employer directly if you're quote unquote injured at work. The issue here, what we're going to have with the workers' comp claim is going to say, well, the causation problem. This is a very contagious virus, and it's very difficult to prove where in fact you got it. Now, if you feel like your employer is grossly negligent, that might be another case. But I think the causation issue will be big here. But generally, the answer is, of course, that you can't sue your employer. You have to go through workers' compensation for any type of those claims. If you don't have workers' compensation, then you could file a direct claim against your employer.
And let me follow up by asking this question, both to you, Felicia, and to Jonathan, starting with Felicia. Can I get fired if I test positive for the virus?
Brian, I would say that there are protections for workers right now who have tested positive. There could be various protections under statutes such as the American with Disabilities Act, although it depends on whether or not the COVID-19 will be defined as a disability under that act. There are also, in certain jurisdictions, state and local protections against terminating an individual on the basis of an illness. So I think there are certain protections in place, and potentially that employee could have a wrongful termination claim against their employer.
Jonathan?
Yes, I totally agree with Ms. Ennis. Obviously, now there's the Paid Sick Leave Act that just passed on the federal level, and that offers specific protections because they want people at the time it was passing, there were still people going to work. They don't want those people laid off and fired. So there's inherent protections in that federal law that says if you're suffering from the virus, you have to stay home. Not only can't you be fired, but you have to be paid during that time. And that even goes to whether or not you're not sick yourself, you're actually taking care of somebody, you're protected during that time and need to be paid for that time. So that was a hot topic. Obviously, now that we're in somewhat of a quarantine state, it's not as relevant it was beforehand when everybody was encouraged to go to work. But once this quarantine is up, I'm sure that'll be highlighted again. It's a very poor decision to try to fire an employee who's sick with COVID-19.
Exactly. Well, here's a question, Felicia and Jonathan. I just graduated college, so I have not had a job, and I have a child. Does this mean I'm not able to get the $1,200 check?
Brian, that's another good question in terms of guidances. I would have to say we're still waiting for some of those guidances to come down, but to the extent that the individual hasn't filed a tax return in the last year or two, there may be an issue there, but again, we're still waiting for those guidances.
Jonathan?
Yeah, can they possibly apply for unemployment because basically the extended unemployment, maybe that's a good remedy. Can they expect the $1,200? I just don't know the answer to that yet. We have to look into it.
We still have to wait. A lot of the details in this still coming out of that huge bill that was passed in such a record amount of time. Here's a question. If your employer gives you an N95 mask and tells you you have to wear it for a week before they can give you another one, is that a violation of OSHA?
That's a good question, Brian. And I know that under OSHA, they have issued some temporary regulations regarding some of the COVID-19 issues. So I would tell your viewer to check with the OSHA regulations. But certainly, I think these new guidances are being issued almost on a daily basis now. I know I checked the OSHA website over the weekend, and they still had some updates to that section in terms of, depending on also the industry that you're in. I know that there are special guidances for healthcare workers and so forth in terms of masks, but because they're in such high demand now, you could be asked to wear a mask longer in this situation than you would normally have had to wear one.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so for the OSHA regulations, you have to feel like there's some imminent danger for your life or serious injury. That's generally the standard, and it's a reasonable person standard. So this is questionable. I think we're right up to that line if an essential worker could refuse based on these OSHA regulations and not come to work. But I could tell you, the general viewpoint is, these healthcare workers are giving it their all, and they're jeopardizing their own safety to come in. So hopefully we'll get these masks that they need very soon, and this won't be an issue. Most essential workers can't use the OSHA regs at this time. However, unless the employer says, hey, you have to take a trip and take a flight and go to China or Italy, maybe then that will rise to the level of some type of imminent danger and serious injury or life-threatening harm. So it is a pretty high standard.
All right, well, here's a question. As I understand it, writes our viewer, I should only do one or the other, receive monies from my small business employer or apply for the unemployment benefit myself. I have no interest in double dipping. What's my best course of action?
Brian, I mean, in terms of whether or not the individual is eligible for unemployment, he or she may want to try applying. And in terms of whether or not as a small business or sole proprietor, they would be eligible for a loan, I mean, that might be two different things. But certainly because these eligibility requirements are still coming out from the Small Business Association, I would say, to your viewer that you should try. Understood that you don't want to double dip, but you don't know exactly where you're going to qualify at this point. So getting in your application could be important.
And John?
Thank you. I mean, I can tell you that as an employee, you can't apply unless you're fired, you're laid off, you're furloughed. If your employer is paying you through that time, you really, you can't apply. You're not going to be approved. If you're an employer and an employee and you don't want to, quote unquote, double dip, I mean, the answer is the SBA, again, it starts out as a loan. It doesn't necessarily turn into the grant unless you provide all that correct information. But one of the interesting points with the employer and employee issue with unemployment, as Ms. Ennis mentioned, the federal government is going to end up subsidizing and paying everybody an additional $600 a week on top of whatever the state benefit is. So really the comical thing in a sense is if I'm an employer, I have two employees, one's a superstar, one is expendable, I'm going to get rid of the expendable one. But if they make under a certain amount of money, they're going to apply for unemployment. They're going to get their state benefit plus the $600. They might make more money by staying at home versus the employee who's required to come to work, which could cause some resentment. So what I'm telling my employer friends is, listen, just sit the person down who you're keeping and say, hey, listen, it might seem like it's a benefit to begin with, but once that's up, everyone's going to be looking for a job. Now you have job security. But it's an interesting point, the fact that they didn't cap it at 100% and cap unemployment at 100% of what the person would make. They'd actually allow someone who's sitting home for that time to make more money had they gone into work.
That's amazing. Here's a question for one of our viewers. I've been laid off for the last week. The week prior, I was working from home to protect my family. I took a huge hit to my income. I was told I could not file for any type of sick leave. Is this correct? What are my options?
Well, Brian, in response to your viewer's question, it's unclear whether the viewer would be eligible for any of the paid sick leave benefits or paid family leave benefits now under the new Families First Response Act. And those benefits have not come into effect yet. They're due to come into effect on April 1st. So it's coming shortly. But to the extent that he is no longer able to work or no longer working, he can certainly apply for state unemployment benefits today. But once you're not working, though, I do not believe that the benefits under the federal act will apply to you in terms of sick leave or paid family leave benefits.
All right. And Jonathan, you want to add to that? A couple more questions here before we sign off.
No, I don't think I need to add to that. That was a very complete answer.
All right. Just a final question before we sign off for today. Question, there will likely be many legal issues coming up. The courthouses are now closed across the country. What will the courts do about the backlog once they reopen? We've got about 30 seconds.
Brian, that's an excellent question. Courts here, I know in New York State, have a long history of backlogs, but as I think everyone is going to need to adapt to the new normal. And hopefully, I would imagine they would set some guidelines in terms of hearing perhaps more essential cases first. And I know we've been receiving guidances almost on a daily basis from the courts. So I'm confident that they will be able to work out a workable system.
All right, I'm going to cut it off there. Felicia Ennis, thank you very much, a partner at Walsh Oberstein, and Jonathan Bell, the founder of the Bell Law Group. Thank you so much for answering questions. If you need a real lawyer, call a lawyer. This is just advice to give you a sense of what your rights are. You want to follow us on social media, on Twitter, Law and Crime News, and at Law and Crime Network, on Facebook at Law and Crime, and on Instagram at Law and Crime. Thank you so much. We'll be back again on Wednesday. Tomorrow, Jesse Weber will be here at 3 o'clock to bring you up to date what's going on in the world of courts and all the trials we've been covering.